Roach. David Roach is the vice chairman of the state licensing board. Very, very progressive with legislative issues, national media, very well known throughout the state. We appreciate his input. Dick Ivey is the third member. He is the current president of Georgia Funeral Directors Association. He's very experienced in funeral service, but he's also Georgia's policy board rep with NFDA. The fourth member of that team is Jason Holt. Jason has agreed to be our Ebola response team chairman and coordinator for the state. More about that momentarily, but Jason is DMORT certified, currently active in Region 4 of that federal system, and he has also, as Bryant, has been deployed a number of times. I was the fifth member of that team, and my background includes healthcare as a director at a major tertiary healthcare system where we integrated with the military, statewide networks, disaster planning, mutual aid, and in my counterterrorism and security consulting role, we trained major transportation organizations and all manner of state, federal, and local government authorities all over the country with port authorities, light and heavy rail, national icons, all of that. So we kind of pulled people together on a team that had a diversity of experience. So funeral directors are wondering about the CDC guidelines. They were very general. They did not particularly provide very good boots on the ground information. And if I'm clicking for the next, there we go. Okay. The truth is that the CDC will never provide instructions at the level this profession needs to do its job. However, they would never provide that level of detail of how you go into a room and come out of a room, or what kind of transportation. They would never provide that for any profession. Here's why. I want you to imagine a pyramid for a second. At the top of the pyramid is, in the United States, what's known as the National Response Framework. That framework guides any kind of response in our country. Within that framework is something called the National Incident Management System. It's also called NIMS for short. NIMS is the management template that allows the entire community of responders to work together. That entire community is every level of government, all non-government agencies, and the private sector. So anytime something happens anywhere, it doesn't matter if it's local, state, or national, our responders are going to be using this NIMS system. The things that it covers: biological, a catastrophic incident, a cyber incident, food issues, mass evacuation, nuclear, radiological, or terrorism. All of that falls under NIMS. Within this response system is 15 different emergency support functions, and for short they're called ESF. By way of example, these are groups of functions that are lumped together with defined roles in an emergency. ESF 1, for example, is transportation. ESF 4 is firefighting. So ESF 8 is the one where funeral service fits in. ESF 8 is public health and medical services. And the reason I wanted to spend a little time talking about that is because those are the people in your state. In order to get your local plan approved, you have to integrate with them, work with them, tell them what your intentions are, and then they will take that input and create the template for the public health response to Ebola. We are very concerned about the fact that people keep forgetting in an Ebola response every agency that is responding except funeral service, they're all government or they're quasi-government. And by quasi-government, those are organizations that accept state and federal funds like Medicare and Medicaid. Funeral service is the only private business that's considered a critical part of this response team. So we're going to get later into some parts of the presentation where we talk about how you address that. But public health, I cannot emphasize enough that public health is where your plan will be approved. Public health is how they know who in your state has agreed to respond to an Ebola death, and it's also how they know who to contact within funeral service in order to get mortuary response to an Ebola death. The planning effort in Georgia, it says 6 years in the making, and that's the hard-hitting portion of our plan. And it wasn't directed at Ebola. It was actually an all-hazards plan. Your state association, if it is like ours, has officers that rotate through the chairs. And this, quite frankly, is a longer-term proposition with integrating into your state network than just the 4 or 5 years that takes for people to rotate through. So our association's long-term strategic priority is to be integrated. In our state, we have a very small office, so that meant that in my job, it became part of my job function to reach out to public health, Georgia Emergency Management, the Federal Emergency Management groups, our hospital association, our EMS groups in Georgia, the CDC. I happen to have a background in some of that. However, I want to assure you, you don't have to have that background to integrate with these. So find somebody in your state who's going to have longevity, whether it's your state exec for your association, it's a funeral director that's going to be there for a long time, but it needs to be somebody who can keep up with it and who is the contact point for the state. Funeral service has been left out of the picture if you are not part of those training groups and planning groups. They all have planning functions that support the living, and once somebody's dead, it's off their radar, and you still have a job to do. So in Georgia, we did not want to be the weak link in the chain of response to this or anything else. So all those years ago, we recognized that Georgia has the world's busiest airport. The CDC is here. We have the 4th busiest port in the country. We're a major north, south, and east-west artery for the interstate highway system. We're just a target for all sorts of mischief. This plan is about Ebola, but our high-level plan can work for any hazard. And that's what we're encouraging people to think about, is putting your structure together in advance. In this particular protocol for Ebola, we have some basic assumptions. That, first of all, Ebola will be successfully contained and you'll have very few deaths. If that parameter doesn't remain, if the disease moves toward epidemic, this plan is going to migrate as well. As Bryant starts covering each of these recommendations, do ask questions at the end, because literally each step of this was vetted and evaluated among a large number of possible options for every single step. You note, for example, some gaps in the protocol at the CDC. This is they call it Ebola a level A pathogen, which requires a self-contained air supply and PPE. However, the guidelines did not specify that. So the other assumption in our plan is that because we care about, obviously, our families, the employees, and the public, we have erred on the side of caution, way on the side of caution. To implement this plan, one of the first things you need to do when you get your plan put together, go to your local hospital, your coroner or medical examiner, and anybody else in your plan and go over what you are planning to do as funeral service in great detail to make sure they're on the same page as you. In our state, we elected to create one mortuary team that is going to respond to everybody, hospitals, coroners, all of that. And this is because we felt that someone who knew already the PPE and they had the knowledge of OSHA and the experience to do this, it was the safest practice, but also it would reduce liability to individual funeral establishments and to all the people who were participating. All the hospitals in the country weren't familiar with how to handle Ebola. Well, funeral homes aren't either, and it's not reasonable to expect that every funeral home in the country is immediately going to be able to do this. We will all get there, but it's not today, and it looks like randomly around the country we may have these deaths. No one outside of funeral service, and this has been proven by everybody that we've talked to, nobody knows what you do. They have no idea your concerns are in handling a deceased individual, let alone an Ebola patient. So literally we are on our own in creating these parameters. Here are some parameters. We're going to slow down in an Ebola case. Everybody probably on this phone call has responded to a death in a hospital. They want that body out of there, out of sight, as fast as they possibly can move it. They're going to try to move it to the morgue, all of those things. Well, in Ebola, that's not going to happen. You're going to slow down. That room is as contaminated as it is ever going to be, so they're going to leave that deceased in place until the crematory or the grave space is 100% ready to accept the deceased, and be emphatic about that. Everything for removal, transport, and final disposition has to be in place first. And you and only you can set that expectation with the hospital. You need to tell them that now and not in the middle of an Ebola removal. In Georgia, we did recommend that cremation would be the preferred method of final disposition, and our public health 100% agreed with us. There are some civil rights and some constitutional rights that play into that. So the draft recommendation we have says infected human remains shall be cremated unless bona fide religious grounds are expressed within 24 hours of death. Everything we recommended, they agreed with. But again, our guidelines are very high level. That's what you should expect back when you get your plan back from public health. High level, it's going to be up to you to do boots on the ground. So without further preparatory comments, Bryant Hightower is going to give you that boots on the ground protocol.
Thank you, Elisa. And let me just follow up on some of what Elisa has said. As we began to put this plan together, we, of course, were in contact with public health, and they have vetted this. And once we submitted our plan, they accepted it and made no recommendations for change. And the reason we went down this path is we were getting calls from funeral directors all over the state, and now I'm talking about the State Board of Funeral Service, as to what they needed to do to prepare, because as you'll remember, the initial set of guidelines that came out from the CDC, while recognizing that Ebola was a level A pathogen, did not require even the minimum universal precaution requirements that most of us take in our prep rooms today. So we as funeral service professionals realized that they weren't on the same page with their recommendation for funeral service and their acknowledgement that Ebola was a level A pathogen. So we realized that in order to protect the professionals in this state, we needed to develop our own plan. We approached the Georgia Funeral Directors Association, enlisted their help. They were 100% on board, and President Ivey graciously allowed Elisa to become a part of our committee because she has a wealth of experience and also had the ability to create the structure inside this plan we needed. So I want to commend GFDA and thank Elisa for their help in fulfilling our mission. But as we talked to the people at Public Health and we made them aware that once a plan was put in place, that it would take some time to execute that plan, they very readily agreed that, yes, there's no sense of hurry, no sense of urgency. And as a matter of fact, the doctor that I talked to at Georgia Public Health said, is a 48-hour window satisfactory? And I said, absolutely. I think that gives us time to put things in motion and to, with maybe a few exceptions, get everything in place. So they were very much on board about that. They understood the need for preparation and that there was no sense of urgency. We also recognized, as Elisa said, for us to try to train 700 funeral homes around the state of Georgia was not practical. Not only did they not have the baseline knowledge that would be necessary to train them effectively in the use of PPEs and removal of a highly contagious death, we quickly realized that funeral directors didn't want to become directly involved unless it was absolutely necessary. They would fulfill the call if necessary, but if there was an option given them in order to protect their employees and to protect the families they serve, they were very readily agreeable to such an idea. So we began to go down the path understanding that we needed to create a team. A consensus amongst the group was we would come up with a team who did possess that baseline knowledge that we could begin to train that would take care of a death that occurred anywhere in the state of Georgia. We understand that should an Ebola patient come to Georgia from out of state, chances are it'll land at Emory University Hospital, but we also know that with our port in Savannah and in Brunswick, and a lot of those ships fly the Liberian flag, that there's a chance that an Ebola victim could present himself on our Georgia coast. So we understand that that possibility exists in other parts of our state, but the team that we created would respond wherever that need arose. They have met, they have been identified, they are undergoing training, additional training to what they've already had, and we will continue as a part of the committee to talk to Jason and other members of his team to make sure they have what they need in the way of protection, personal protective equipment, as well as any other things that we need to provide to make sure they can adequately do their jobs and protect themselves. Elisa also said that you're going to notice we have erred on the side of caution. A lot of you, once I finish this presentation, are going to say that's overkill, that wasn't necessary, that's not the way they did it here, that's not the way they did it there. I quite frankly could care less how they did it anywhere else. Our ultimate goal here was two things. Number one was to take care of the deceased, treat them with dignity and respect and care for their family. But secondly, it was also to protect the public and the funeral service professionals involved. And I think you'll notice that this plan does err on the side of caution. We have gone down that road and probably erred way on the side of caution, but I do believe it's the best plan we could develop to protect the public and to protect the funeral service professionals. We did make certain assumptions. Those were that we have very few hospitals in this state that are Ebola ready, Emory being one of them. If you remember, the first two Ebola patients brought to the U.S. did come to Emory University Hospital and did live to walk away, thank God. We separated our trained team into really three different groups. The first group being, and I've just lost the webinar, so somebody else is going to have to, Elisa, can you take over the screen for me? Hello? Hello? Hello?
We're standing by.
I'm here. I'm here. I got it. I got it.
Okay, it went completely dead on me for some reason.
Okay.
Okay. I'll keep talking, Elisa, and if you can just kind of keep up with me on the slide, so I don't know.
I'll do it.
What malfunction.
We're checking on this side.
Okay. we have three different components in our team. One would be the family liaison. We understood very early on that a lot of the Ebola patients who have been sent to faraway hospitals, Emory, for instance, the hospital in Dallas, the gentleman who lost his life just shortly ago in Nebraska, are sent there for very specialized care. But their families may or may not be there. They may be quarantined back at home, or they may be overseas. So we understood the need to develop a plan that would afford us an opportunity to make sure that the family's needs were met. So we established the job of a family liaison. This person would begin contact with the family once this team has been mobilized and would tend to their needs. Also would coordinate with any funeral home they may have back at home that's planning memorialization and so forth to help in processing death certificates and any of the things that need to be done on the ground in the state of Georgia, so that we don't have a disconcerted effort that doesn't meet the family's needs. The next part of the team is what we call an enclosure team. This is the team who is in charge of going into the medical facility, accepting the deceased from the medical team, making sure that that person is properly enclosed, and we'll talk about this in just a few minutes more in depth, and making them ready for the transport team. The transport team would then transport the deceased not only from the hospital to the waiting vehicle, but from the vehicle directly to the place of final disposition, be that the crematory or be that a hospital, a cemetery. In talking to public health, they very strongly agreed and almost mandated at the point that cremation would be the form of disposition that they would require. They do understand the need to allow for burial in certain religious instances and would bend to that, but asked us to develop a protocol for that, and we'll talk about that more in depth in just a few minutes. So the body would go directly from that medical facility to the gravesite or to the crematory, and again, we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. The enclosure team would consist of no less than 2 people, and that again depends on the size of the individual. As funeral service professionals, we realize that to adequately handle the deceased person, especially in an environment like you would find where you're constantly disinfecting the area, you may need more people than 2 to adequately secure the body into the body bags and to transport the body. So that will be a decision made by that team based on the size of the individual and also based on the confines of the area they're asked to work in. The response team must include at least 1 licensed funeral director. We very early on also recognized that the team might consist of all funeral service personnel, but might consist of emergency medical personnel who have had hazmat training, firemen who have had hazmat training and are cross-trained. So we may call on other professions and other parts of our state to help us find the individuals who will respond on our team. And as a matter of fact, I think Jason has done that. We also developed, if you will notice there, the transport team. We would not transport a body from that facility in a body bag. The body will be triple bagged, and we'll talk about that, but we recognize the need for that body to be placed in a rigid container to afford even more protection for the public and for those that would come in contact, and to afford an ease of transportation. So that's what you see there, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. We would suggest that a family contact the funeral director of their choice in their area of residence, and again, that person could then be in touch with our family liaison to make sure that everything's done on our part to help meet the family's needs, to help ease their mind that things are being properly taken care of in Georgia, keep them fully appraised of what's going on, help answer any questions they may have, again, assist in making sure death certificates are expedited and that any help on this end is given. That family liaison would also be in charge of making sure that the death certificate, again, is properly filed, that the burial transit permit is issued, and that any family authorizations that need to be gathered would be gathered. We also, as I said, recognize that there may be unattended Ebola deaths. I think it's unlikely to happen unless it exacerbates itself beyond the random events that we've seen in the past. but understanding that that could happen, our team would stand ready to respond to any coroner or medical examiner in the state and work much within the same way they would in a hospital setting. Talk just a little bit about initiating the mortuary process. Again, as Elisa said, slowing down is ultimate here. We've got to get the team mobilized. We have to have everything in place so that there is no glitch, there is no slowdown. Once the team goes into action, it works seamlessly. The initial response team would be notified by the hospital or by public health that the death has occurred. They would advise us on the method of final disposition. We have established one telephone number for the entire state that will be answered 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that team is on call. We also recognize the need for that team to be larger than you might think, because these people will not always be available based on travel or schedule at work or whatever may be called on for them. So, you know, it's important that Jason build a team that's large enough that when called upon does have adequate members to respond. The body, of course, has been picked up at place of death and would work with the hospital personnel to ensure that the body is properly cared for before transportation. So before initiating the team, before the team went into action, they would let us know the final disposition so that it's either cremation or burial. That way the team knows what kind of rigid container to bring with them to the medical facility, be it a rigid container for cremation or be it a metal casket which is designed to seal for burial. They would let us know the weight of the individual, and that would be given to the team, again, for two reasons: the size of the team that may need to be to respond, and also should an oversized container be necessary, the team would be made aware of that in that initial call. The hospital or other location where the deceased resides would leave the body in place until the team arrives. Our enclosure team would respond directly into that isolation room where the body would be identified by medical personnel to our team. They would also make our team aware of the secure route to exit, and our transport team would stand ready in that location. The crematory would be open and ready to receive the remains. Once we left the hospital, they would be called and be waiting for us. If burial was to take place, the grave will have been opened, the vault would be in place, and the cemetery would have been secured as to prevent media and other gawkers from being in place. It's important to protect the dignity of the individual who's passed, and also to ensure that we don't create any more panic on the part of the public than has already been done. Okay? When we arrive, the deceased, of course, as I said, is still in the room where he expired. We would call this the hot zone, if you will. This is where our personnel will come into contact with more pathogens than any other part of our process. It is assumed that the hospital will have full PPEs available for the response team. In Georgia, we're now evaluating this to ensure that our team would be adequately protected. If they will not be made available to them by the hospital, we will have those PPEs available for our team so that they have them with them when they respond. Our team would go into the hot zone. The body would be left on the bed. The body and any coverings on the body would be placed into a body bag. The body bag then would be decontaminated with a solution of 1 to 10 bleach and water. The body bag is rolled. The back is also decontaminated and rolled back over. And this is all done on a mortuary level cot. We then would take that body bag and place it in a hermetically sealed bag known in the trade as BioSeal. We went back and forth with the state health folks on whether to use the BioSeal bag first or second. We felt like it would be easier and safer for our people if we got the body in a body bag that could be decontaminated initially, that afforded them handles for turning and moving, and then place that bag in a BioSeal bag. The BioSeal bag would be sealed, heat crimped. The BioSeal bag then is decontaminated, front and back, just as we did the initial bag. That bag is then placed in another body bag. That body bag is decontaminated, and we've been asked, well, why the third bag? Anybody that's ever handled BioSeal, you know it doesn't have handles. We're going to be decontaminating using bleach and water. You've got on rubber gloves. You can imagine trying to grasp and grip and carry and move. So we felt like getting the body back into a body bag that afforded us handles for transportation, protection, ease of movement was the smart way to go. We then would roll the cot into the anteroom outside the isolation room. The team who's been in the hot zone do not need to leave the hot zone. They would pass the body cot and the body off to the team in the anteroom who are still in full level A pathogen PPEs. On a church truck that would, of course, have no drape on it, they would have the rigid container awaiting. Again, it's a cremation container in the case of cremation, or a 20-gauge metal casket minimum for burial. Initially, in our conversation with the folks at Public Health, they recommended a sealed metal casket for all. We, of course, very early on had to explain to them that the metal casket could not be used in the case of cremation. They understood that and recommended approval of our plan using just the alternative rigid container, something more than cardboard for cremation. The body then is transported off of the cot into that rigid container. The cremation container is properly closed, or the metal casket is properly sealed. The cot would then be decontaminated again. This is the third time that cot's been decontaminated. The casket then is decontaminated, as are the church trucks. When the church trucks leave that room, there is a pad on the floor soaked in the 1 to 10 bleach solution that the wheels would roll across to decontaminate the wheels before they enter the public hallway of the hospital. The transport team would have a two-person team waiting outside the anteroom in a clean area in a lower level PPE to receive the casket after it's been properly decontaminated, as have the church trucks. They then would transport the body down a secure hallway already identified to them by the hospital personnel that has been secured and carried to a waiting van where they would place the body in the transport container, into that van. They would then decontaminate the church trucks again, and they would be left at the medical facility for the other personnel to collect. They would then decontaminate themselves, take off those PPEs, and physically drive the body to the awaiting crematory or hospital. We recommend that they be escorted, not with lights and siren, but to ensure if there was a problem in transport, a flat tire, an accident, that there are people there that could secure that scene and protect the integrity of the body, and to make sure that there is no contamination should some event unforeseen occur. All the PPEs that have been used at the medical facility would be collected by the hospital for disposal, just as they would any of their PPEs. So no necessity for those PPEs to be collected and to be removed from that medical facility. The transport team drives the body to that facility which is waiting. They arrive at the crematory. The retort has been warmed. The transport team arrives. The container is removed from that van and placed onto the cart for transportation to the retort. Before doing that, and I got a little ahead of myself, they would don those minimum level PPEs again, including gloves, eye shield, and gown. At the crematory and or the cemetery, there will also be a biohazard container in place as well as a bleach solution for decontamination. They leave the van, don their PPEs, remove the casket, transport it to the retort, and they would unload the body directly off of that transport carrier into the retort. The certified crematory operator at the crematory would never touch the casket or the remains. Once the body has been loaded into the retort is closed. The transport team then would return to the vehicle. They would decontaminate the transport wagon that was used from the van to the retort. They would also decontaminate their van. Take off their PPEs, place them in the biohazard bag and the container provided for disposal of their PPEs. At that point, the certified crematory operator could start the cremation process. It's important that the crematory operator understand that under no circumstances should they open the retort to reposition the body, and we have recommended a longer cremation period without interruption to ensure full cremation has taken place. The crematory operator would wear standard PPEs until the end of the process, and of course no infectious or contagious agent would remain at the end of the cremation process. However, in an abundance of caution and prevent them from inhaling any dust in the cremation during the pulverization of the remains, we would recommend that they don the same PPEs that they normally would use when processing cremated remains. The ashes are then placed in the urn, and the urn would then be sealed at that point. And of course, at this point, they pose no public hazard. In the event of burial, the recommendations remain the same for removal from the medical facility. The change would actually take place in that anteroom where the body would be taken and placed in a sealer metal casket rather than in a rigid alternative container for cremation. Our public health does recognize that in certain religious, with certain religious objections, this may need to be allowed for final disposition, and they have at this point shown a willingness to allow that. This does, I think, depend on whether these are random deaths or whether it would become an epidemic. They would require a minimum of 24-hour notification to all authorities that this was going to take place. The body would be placed, as I said, not only in a sealer casket, but in a sealed vault. Our public health would not allow an air seal vault, as the possibility would present itself that bodily fluids could escape from an air seal vault. They would require a concrete vault with a mastic seal as a minimum, a lined concrete vault. Before the burial could be scheduled, all aspects of the grave certainly would be ready. The cemetery has been contacted. Again, the grave has been opened. The vault is in place before the body ever leaves the hospital, and as a matter of fact, probably before our team ever arrives at the hospital. In our state, we don't have this consideration, but this is something we've thought about for other states, recognizing that there are states where weather conditions in certain times of the year may not allow burial. That would be something that public health in your state would have to weigh. And I can tell you, based on our conversations in Georgia, if burial could not be immediately accomplished, I don't believe our public health would allow burial. I think they would mandate the crematory option.
Right.
In the event of burial, the casketed remains arrive at the hospital. We're recommending that the van, of course, be allowed to go as close to the grave as is possible, that members of our team in PPEs would receive the casket from the van, transport it to the waiting lowering device. They would then, these are funeral directors, lower that casket into the vault. We recommend that the straps lowering that casket could be left with that casket since they've come in direct contact and they're cloth and would be hard to disinfect, that they be disconnected from the lowering device and left with the casket. Lowering device would be moved. The lid would be placed over the vault and the vault would be sealed at that point. If it's been necessary to transport the casket from the van in a vehicle, we recommend a motorized four-wheel vehicle with a non-porous bed that could be decontaminated once it served its purpose for transport from the van to the gravesite. We recommend that if possible, no more than 4 individuals that are members of our team handle transport from the van to the gravesite. The transport team would then disinfect any equipment they have used at the gravesite, disinfect their van, doff all PPEs, place them in a BioSeal bag that would have already been made available to them at the cemetery, and that would be sealed in a biohazard box ready for transportation for incineration. The vault is, of course, then lowered in the presence of the funeral director, and the grave is covered. At this point, if it were a local death or if the family was present, it would certainly be made available to them for a graveside service, but not until the grave had been closed. As it relates to memorialization, we recognize that the family very much needs to be involved in this process. That's the reason for the family liaison initiating contact with them very early on so that he can truly be their liaison between what's happening in Georgia and maybe what's happening back in Iowa or California or wherever they may be. He would ensure them his cooperation and the cooperation of other members of the team, and would urge them to seek out a funeral professional to assist them with memorialization. If they didn't have a choice, it's our recommendation that he be allowed to contact the state association in the state where they reside for a list of funeral homes in their area for referral. We very much want them to be taken care of just as we would take care of any other family in a time of loss. It appears to us, not knowing what's happened on the ground, that this possibly could have happened in some other instances where there was a fractured response and the family may or may not have had all their needs met. So we would continue those communications with the family until we were sure that all the necessary needs that they may have had were met and that any help the funeral director on their end may have also been taken care of. We would, discuss the highest level of public safety and cremation recommendation, making them aware of why that was necessary, and also reinforce the importance of memorialization. The key messages that we would give to other directors are to certainly engage the family in that process, and as they plan for memorialization, again, they may be removed from this area, and we all understand in funeral service that what normally would happen is they'd work for a funeral director on their end who would have an agent on his end who would step in and act for him, but he would be the go-to person on his end. In this instance, that's going to be a very difficult model to follow, so that's the reason we recommend that they cooperate with each other and that our family liaison be allowed to serve as his agent on our end. But we would strongly consider or strongly recommend to families the need for memorialization and the need to engage with a funeral professional in their area. The identification of the body, which is required in Georgia, would be done in the hospital setting. As I said, when we arrive in the hot zone, the medical professionals on site would identify that remains to our medical professionals, and then our team would affix the labeling that is required to the outer container, not directly to the body. And it would be in a way that could also be decontaminated. In the case of public health where an unattended death might take place, public health could declare an unidentified remains as a John Doe, photograph the victim for possible future identification, and then a standard body bag would be affixed to the outermost container, and then public health could require immediate cremation. Again, that's in the case of an unattended death, which probably we would only see if this reached epidemic proportions, which all of us hope never happens. The only difference that we really see in an unattended death and those in hospital settings would be that where we would receive the body, whether it would be in a home, in a hotel, a public place. We don't believe that these bodies, if they are known Ebola victims, would ever be carried into a mortuary facility or a crime lab. We suspect that they would be left as long as they were at a facility that would be secured until the mortuary team was allowed to make that removal. That would certainly be our recommendation to the coroners and medical examiners. Once the team had been mobilized and public health or family had consented to method of disposition, we would respond to that facility just like we would have to a medical facility and afford the means of disposition that was asked for either by public health or by the family. Okay. Elisa has also worked very closely with public health, and I have to say that her contacts with people in public health and with GEMA have made the formulation of this plan a lot easier. Had we started this process without those contacts, it would have made it a much more difficult process for us. But because the groundwork had been laid, we had contacts, we had credibility, talking about Elisa and GFDA, since they already possessed that credibility with those agencies, it made it a much easier effort for us to undertake, and they were very receptive. And I suspect most of you would find that the case in your state. I'll turn it over to Elisa to talk about some family issues, right of disposition and so forth, which have also been vetted with public health.
Thanks, Brian. The bad news in an Ebola death is that it's not going to get any easier to deal with families than what you deal in your selection room, unfortunately. We imagined as we talked through this, people are going to be sent to these coordinating hospitals who can handle an isolation of Ebola. Well, maybe the family then is in Texas or California, or maybe they're illegal immigrants. You have no idea what's going to happen here. So the recommendation is, first of all, every state, of course, has code sections in law that describe who has the right of disposition in your state. That's what you have to use as a starting point. Georgia in 2009 was the fourth state to adopt the NFDA right of disposition guidelines, and that is in our code section. So it's got the 1 through 12 exact order of who in any given situation has that right and when they lose that right. But one difference that we enacted with public health is that public health, under its statutory authority to declare this, has said that they, public health, have the authority to sign a cremation authorization form. that is stated in the protocol, and it is part of a different code section in Georgia, but we just imagined a situation where you couldn't find out who had the right of disposition. Maybe that family member is in West Africa, you don't know. So public health has that right, and they also granted that right to coroners and medical examiners in the event that someone couldn't be found or they couldn't agree. We have a number of forms that were prepared by NFDA that we have given to public health, and they have vetted them. The first one is the claim of authority to carry out disposition. I'm not going to go into detail in that, but basically Scott Gilligan took our state law and created a disposition, and the person signs on this form what their relationship is to the deceased, and it goes directly by our code section. The other form we have is the authorization for cremation and disposition. Again, that can be signed by the family, or it can be signed by public health now in Georgia for Ebola or infectious disease. In our code section is an affidavit. That's the third in the rank order of who has final disposition. This last bullet point you see relates to that affidavit. The healthcare power of attorney that exists, we're exploring the possibility of including a section, what are your instructions for final disposition if it's Ebola or other infectious disease? And our thought process was, if you put that in there now, you know, somebody may check into a hospital with Ebola and it not be known, but if everybody coming in signs this form or elects not to sign that section, you at least put it in front of them one time. It's not a surprise, and it starts people thinking down that road of, if the worst should happen, am I comfortable with cremation? Do I want burial? So that the healthcare team and the mortuary team at least have some kind of indication of how that might go. We have another couple of forms that we will recommend to you. These also came from NFDA, and they're standard forms that can be customized to your state. Much as we hate to admit it, all of us, it's only a matter of time before news media wants a picture of an Ebola deceased, or they want a picture of somebody taking that body out of a hospital. So we have recommended to public health and to all of our funeral directors an employee non-disclosure agreement, an employee confidentiality agreement, a contractor and subcontractor confidentiality agreement, and last but not least, a cell phone agreement. And that cell phone agreement includes the fact that you are not allowed to use your cell phone to take pictures or videos in any circumstances anyway, but particularly in Ebola. This cell phone policy is for all deceased, not just Ebola. In our concerns that we talked about, Brian already touched on this a little bit, but we don't feel like the mortuary team is the team that identifies the body. If someone's in a hospital and they've been there, that medical facility knows who they are, and you don't want to be in there trying to write down information when you're in full PPE. So the hospital attests to the body identification. Our public health has agreed to that, because otherwise in our code section, the funeral director at least has to do a visual, and you know, you don't want to do that once the body's in triple body bags in a rigid container. In non-hospital deaths, presumably, again, mortuary team would not be the first responders. There would be a coroner there, there would be EMS. Those people would do the identification in that scenario. And this is an important slide. We're getting toward the end. You probably saw on November 5th that President Obama requested $6.2 billion from Congress. $2 billion of that was for the U.S. Agency for International Development to help contain Ebola in West Africa. $2.4 billion of that was for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and $1.5 billion was for a contingency fund. This is where you come in. Nowhere in there does it mention funeral service. So we have already been on the phone with our national representatives. I know John has talked to his contacts up there. We need resources just like the hospitals and EMS and anybody else. And so call your congressman and point out to them that if people die from Ebola, funeral service needs to be part of the planning, and they need some funding to go to each state that would come down through public health. The question of who pays is a complicated one, and the best we can find out from CDC and from our public health is that any death would be handled state by state and case by case, because you don't know if it's someone who, like the gentleman in Dallas, he went to that hospital. That hospital started treating him, but then the CDC and all these other individuals got involved. In the early stages of this, we've got to believe that there is federal funding for some of it, and particularly when you saw the nurses sent to Atlanta and to Maryland, you know, that becomes interstate, so some of the federal guidelines would start kicking in. There's not an answer who pays for each piece of this yet. So we do recommend that you go to your state when you do whatever your plan is going to say, and we recommend that there's one bill that details everything. That bill should include the removal, the funeral director's time, the crematory bill, or the cemetery space and the opening and closing. Certainly some of that would be covered by the family, particularly if they're electing burial. They would do the burial space, but if you're mandating a vault, your state has to decide, does the state cover that? Are you getting some federal grant money for that? We're attempting to negotiate a rate with our public health for our removal services so that each individual funeral home doesn't get caught up in that and try to figure out how, when a team's coming from all over the state, who would pay for that. It becomes real complicated. Everyone has a strong incentive for the highest level of caution with this and the safety of our personnel. Another question that we have asked our public health is, if you call our team to protect everyone in the hospital and the public, then does our team become quasi-employees of public health, and that's who covers their workers' comp? Or does that push back down to the local funeral home? And we, as of yet, don't have that answer. We're probably out a little bit ahead of the issues on these things because, again, nobody knows what funeral service does. And when we get that answer, we'll push it back up to NFPA, and they can push that back out to all the participants. And that, John and Colleen, I think ends what Bryant and I had to present today.
Yes, I don't think I have anything to add, Elise.
Thank you, Bryant and Elisa. We are now taking questions. I do have a number in the queue that I'll be happy to read for our experts, and I will begin as participants are entering other questions. First one is from Jay regarding BioSeal bags. He would like to know what the course of action is if they don't carry them or other local funeral homes do not carry them as well. What are alternatives?
Right now, our state health agency is requiring BioSeal, and so there are vendors out there that can make that available to you. Again, that was one reason that we felt like a coordinated effort was best, so that every funeral home in the state didn't have to reach out to a vendor and know they could lay their hands on it. It'll be made available to our team. The tool for sealing will be made available to them. So, reach out depending on how you decide to respond, whether it's individually or through a coordinated effort, and just make sure you either have that or it can be made readily available to you in the case the need arises.
Thank you. When you were discussing the right of disposition, Douglas is looking for clarification. He says that in Washington State, the law spells out the order of who in the family has the right of disposition. He's wondering if you were saying, can we legally circumvent this in the event of an Ebola death?
I can't speak for Washington, and Elisa's more versed in this than I am, but the answer we've gotten from our public health agency is yes. They do have a statutory authority in the event of an infectious death to override the wishes of the family. It would be our hope that through communicating with the family, that they could be brought into that process and it wouldn't be necessary for that to take place. But based on what we've been told, they do have that statutory authority, at least in Georgia. Am I right up there, Elise?
Yes, and public health recognizes they don't want to do anything to harm a family emotionally when they have already experienced something very traumatic. But every public health statutorily in the United States has the right to override it. I do think they would be very reluctant. And that's why when we got our guidelines back, they did specifically state that you could have a religious objection, a bona fide religious objection. And I'm quite assuming that there would be some fairly intense conversations in a very compassionate way with the family. What we're hearing is that families understand that they don't want to create a situation where other people are going to be infected, and that's one of the reasons in our plan we have requested early on that the family be given the opportunity to select a funeral director, because we believe a funeral director would be the best person who can talk them through a selection on cremation. And if the family does have a bona fide religious problem, or, the other thing our team discussed, you could have a body of an extremely obese individual that it would be very difficult to cremate. And we didn't talk about that today, but there will be some situations where burial will have to be the choice. For example, people who have radioactive implants for cancer treatment, those people, you'd have to pull in the oncologist and you'd have to learn how long have the implants been in place, how far of the half-life are those implants into. In the early stages of cancer treatment like that, even the person's urine, it can't even go down the toilet because it's so dangerous. So there are some other considerations where you would have maybe a burial instead of cremation. That's probably way more than what you asked, but those are some of the things we talked about.
Alicia, also if the remains contain a pacemaker or defibrillator.
Correct.
Well, what was discussed with some of the folks is that, that of course they won't allow removal of those devices. And we've talked to some crematory operators that, and again, correct me, Elisa, if what I remember is incorrect, but that, you know, they would go ahead and cremate the pacemaker. The risk there was less than trying to remove it.
Yeah, and we should point out, we didn't specifically go into great detail on this, but our plan in Georgia is we are using standalone crematories only. We're not using crematories co-located within a funeral home.
Are you ready to take the next question?
Sure.
Thank you. Would you outright refuse embalming if a family insists on embalming or on a viewing?
Our state health agency has forbidden embalming. The body would have to be immediately buried or immediately cremated. Those are the two means of disposition that up to now they will allow.
That's the same as the CDC guidelines, no embalming, immediate cremation or burial.
Okay. Those are very direct answers. Thank you. Another question. What about a death of an individual who is quarantined but not yet diagnosed with Ebola?
Our plan calls for that individual to be treated as though he did have Ebola. Understanding that he may still be infectious. If our team were mobilized, and it's going to be up to public health and the folks who placed him in quarantine as to whether or not to activate our team, but if our team were activated, we would treat that person as though he was infectious.
Yeah, I think that was the situation of the individual who was just transported and passed away at the Nebraska hospital in Omaha, that he was originally tested in Sierra Leone and had no indication of any infection and came back here and became deathly ill. So the medical people at CDC that I've talked to said that the current blood test doesn't necessarily catch Ebola until the later stages, until some symptoms have manifested themselves. So it takes a while for the virus to get into the bloodstream. So I think that's probably a good way to handle it, Brian.
Okay, thank you. We have a number of other questions here in the next 10 minutes. With what department of the hospital do we need to discuss our plan?
And I'm going to defer to Elisa. She's got more experience in dealing with the hierarchy in hospitals than I do. But I can tell you initially, probably none of them are going to want to talk to you about it, but Elisa.
If I were working in healthcare today, I would want anybody who came into my hospital to discuss Ebola to come through the CEO office, the administrative office, because the team that they are having, and I know this from working with our hospital associations, they have teams within their facility that are creating the protocols within the hospital. So that answer across the country isn't necessarily going to be the same from hospital to hospital. So if you go in through administration and ask them who their coordinator is for infectious disease, they will be able to tell you, because every single one of them at this point has an Ebola team in place live, mandated, and they're not called the same thing all over the country. There's not a standard response among all the different hospitals yet. So go in through your administrative offices and ask.
And I will say, to follow up on what Lisa said, that, and that's what public health has told us, is that every hospital is going to have these teams. But as we began to develop this, was on the heels of the death in Dallas, and as we're working through it, and our public health folks, and I think our folks in our local hospitals have begun to understand that this truly could happen. I think for a while there was a denial that we could suffer Ebola deaths in the United States. They now realize that can happen. And so, unlike so many times when they don't want to talk to funeral directors until a death actually takes place, they understand the need for planning today.
And it's our experience that when, well, back up a minute, we did a mass fatality and an all hazards plan over the last however many years, and this is a two-way street. So here's what happens. Public health does a plan, they push it out, it's all hazards. Every county is instructed in that plan to say, call your local funeral director. Well, they call the local funeral director, they're in Kiwanis together or whatever, and they're like, yeah, we know how to handle deceased individuals. And that is a true statement. Nobody else knows how to do what you do. But then what happens is the public health doesn't turn back around and say, no, they really need to be in the planning effort. So they go merrily along the way. I will promise you, if you contact, in today's world with what's going on with Ebola, if you contact your public health and your hospital, they are going to greet you with open arms, give you flowers and candy, and say, thank God we know who you are and you're willing to do this. They are that nervous about Ebola deaths.
Thank you. Another question. This is from Sarah. Why did you decide to have so many individuals on various teams participate in the removal and transportation of the victim? My concern would be the exposure risk to so many.
Well, if you understand the process, the exposure risk really lessens during the process. And if you look at what happened in Dallas, and I know there's been some finger pointing, but you had nurses out there who say they were following CDC guidelines, and you had 2 nurses that became infected. We, number one, believe that for the team to do the initial enclosure of the body in those body bags, transition for that into an anteroom, and where disinfect themselves all during the process is much more cumbersome and offers more of an opportunity for infection than it does for them to hand that off to people who are not in an infectious state. They're already have not been exposed to an infectious state. They're deconned. The body has already been placed in bags. Yes, we're continuing to protect them, but by that time, by the time the body leaves the hot zone, the body is much less contagious to those individuals and continues to be as it moves through the process. So we don't believe we have placed more people in harm. We believe by segmenting the roles, these people can be trained to do this part of the job, these people can be trained to do this part, and that we actually will reduce their exposure.
And to take that a step further, if you imagine in your mind being outside that hospital room, if you have the body that's come off the cot, it's now on the church trucks with no drape, you've been exposed, you're going to push the decontaminated cot out into the hallway. If you only have 2 people, you're standing there decontaminated, and you've got this Ebola deceased on a church truck sitting in the hallway waiting for you to decontaminate. It's a get it out of the room and smoothly get it all the way down to the transport vehicle.
Yeah, by introducing other people into the process, it works seamlessly, because those individuals would have had to decontaminate themselves, and we would have actually probably recommended that they change PPEs. Well, in this instance, they can stay in that room. They can decontaminate just like the medical professionals will that are in there with them. They'll decontaminate, doff their PPEs, and their part of the process is over for that time.
Okay, thank you. That was really a good question. Here's another one. Are prosthetic joints, et cetera, that remain after the cremation of the victim considered disinfected, and what is the protocol for their disposal?
in our discussions, we have had some of the people who handle the recycling of those prosthetics to tell us that once they had been through the cremation process, that they would be willing to collect them. And public health has agreed to that.
So you take them afterwards and you put them in a biohazard bag, and then that disposal organization would pick it up, but do put it in a biohazard bag,
right.
Even though it's not contagious?
Health agrees that at that point it's probably not biohazard material, but again, in an abundance of caution, just to label it so that they know where it came from. But public health, in our discussion with them, and also the people who do the recycling, have agreed that that's the best way for those to be handled.
Thank you. Another question: what are we doing in the case of ship-outs?
Georgia Public Health has told us there will be no ship-outs. If an Ebola patient is sent to Emory and dies in Georgia, they will not issue a burial transit permit for that body to leave the state of Georgia. It will either be immediately cremated in the state of Georgia or immediately buried. They would never allow that body, because they will not allow embalming, they will never allow that body to cross the state lines. And I don't know if families understand that, if it's been explained to them when these people are brought in from out of state, and I don't know how other states are treating it, but our state was emphatic that they would not allow that body to leave the state of Georgia.
Thank you. How can I get a written copy of the guidelines Georgia uses?
That's an Elisa question.
We are working, we put this together, the presentation, over a fairly quick turnaround so we could push them out. And my job over the next few days will be to get those into what I would consider a reasonable format, because what we're working off right now is the entire, everything you just heard us say is in here, but it's a lot of adverbs and adjectives, and we need to clean it up and tighten it up into what looks more like guidelines. I will be doing that over the next few days, and then I would assume I would send it up to NFDA and they'll push it out.
Okay, thank you, Elisa. We can make that happen. We'll be looking forward to helping you on that. We are at 2:30. There are probably about 6 other questions here. What we can do is we will capture all of those questions, and I will make sure that copies go to Bryant and Elisa and to John, and we will get answers to everyone. We will email those answers out. If that is all right with the 3 of you?
Sure. However you want to handle that, it's fine with me.
Is that all right with you, Elisa? John?
Oh, sure.
Okay, that's what we'll do. We did get most of the questions, and thank you so much for such insightful questions and helpful answers. At this point, we are going to close the webinar. I want to remind you that this was recorded, and we're working on this side to see how we can make it a downloadable option for funeral homes who might want to share this with other people on their staff who maybe couldn't have participated today. So we're working on that. If you do have any additional questions today, when you get off the phone, get off your computer, and you think, oh my gosh, I wanted to ask that, please send that question to www.nfca.org, and we will make sure that those questions are answered as well. You should have the information about getting those questions in the instructions that were sent out to you earlier. So at this point, we thank you all so much. Thank you, Bryant and Elisa and John, for assisting us. And at this point, we're going to end the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.